Welcome to Life Stories. Today, we bring you a powerful tale of kindness, perseverance, and the ripple effects one simple act can have on a life. It's the story of Sarah Adams, a poor widow who, despite her own struggles, changed the life of a young boy named Ben with nothing but her generosity. This is a story that will remind you of the profound impact one person can make, and how a small gesture can lead to extraordinary outcomes. Stay tuned, and let's dive into today's inspiring story. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to never miss a new story. Once upon a time, in a quiet town in America, there lived a woman named Sarah Adams. She was a widow who had endured the harshness of life ever since her husband's untimely death. He had been the breadwinner of their small family, and when he passed away, Sarah found herself alone, with 3 children to care for and little more than the clothes on her back. She was not a woman of wealth, nor did she possess anything beyond the most basic necessities. But despite all her struggles, she maintained a spirit of kindness, a willingness to give even when there was little to offer. Every morning, before the sun had even begun to rise, Sarah would wake up with the roosters. She would get her children ready, send them off to school, and then gather the freshest vegetables she could find at the local farms. These vegetables were her livelihood. She would balance the heavy basket of produce on her head, her back bent with the weight of it all, and walk to the bustling market square. The market was filled with noise and life, vendors calling out to potential customers. The smell of fresh produce mixed with the earthy scent of the day's rain, and the chatter of neighbors exchanging the latest news. Sarah's stall was modest, simple, yet it stood as a testament to her resilience. She did not have the luxury of anything extravagant. She had no savings, no security. The few coins she earned each day barely put food on the table, but they kept her family alive. One particularly scorching afternoon, as Sarah sat under the shade of a small umbrella, trying to arrange the vegetables neatly on her wooden tray, something caught her eye. There, by the side of the road, stood a small boy. His school uniform was ragged and wrinkled, his shoes covered in dust, and his face was buried in his hands as he sobbed uncontrollably. The sight of him struck something deep within Sarah's heart. She had seen suffering before. Her own life was a constant reminder of hardship. But there was something about seeing a child, alone and broken, that stirred a deep sense of empathy in her. She wiped the sweat from her brow, stood up from her small wooden stool, and walked over to him. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. But then, with a gentle voice, she asked, "My son, why are you crying?" The boy looked up at her, his face tear-streaked, his lips trembling as he tried to speak. "They sent me out of the exam hall," he mumbled, his voice shaky. "I couldn't pay my school fees. The principal said I can't take my exams unless I bring the money." Sarah's heart tightened at the boy's words. She could feel the weight of his pain in the pit of her stomach. She looked at him more closely. His shoes were falling apart, and he clutched his school bag like it was the only thing in the world that still mattered to him. She could see the hopelessness in his eyes. She had known that hopelessness, had lived through it herself. It was a feeling she couldn't escape. "What's your name, child?" Sarah asked, her voice softening. "Ben," the boy whispered. "Ben Anderson." Sarah nodded slowly. She had never seen him before, but his suffering was too familiar to her. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out the small bundle of money she had earned that day. It wasn't much, in fact. It was the last of what she had. She still needed to buy food for her own children. But as she looked at Ben, she knew there was no choice. She couldn't just walk away. "Come with me," she said, taking his hand gently in hers. Ben hesitated for a moment, confused by this stranger's sudden kindness. But something in Sarah's eyes reassured him. There was warmth there, a motherly comfort that he had not felt in a long time. He followed her as they walked through the busy market, past the rows of stalls, and down the dusty streets. Sarah's heart raced as they approached the school. She knew what she was about to do was a huge sacrifice, but it felt like the right thing. When they reached the school, Sarah knocked on the principal's door. Her hands were shaking as she stood there, waiting for him to open it. The door swung open, and a stern-looking man peered out at them. "Yes?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. I want to pay this boy's school fees, Sarah said, her voice firm despite the fluttering anxiety in her chest. She placed the small bundle of money on the principal's desk. The principal looked at the money, then up at Sarah, then at Ben, and raised an eyebrow. Are you his mother? He asked, his tone skeptical. No, Sarah replied, shaking her head. But that doesn't matter. For a long moment, the principal simply stared at her. Then, with a heavy sigh, he took the money. Fine, he said, his voice resigned. He can go back to class. Turning to Ben, Sarah smiled warmly. Go, my son. Do well in your exams. Ben's lips parted in shock, disbelief written all over his face. You used your money for me? He stammered. Sarah nodded. Yes. One day, when you grow up, do the same for someone else. Before Ben could say anything else, Sarah turned and began to walk away. Back to her stall, back to her struggles. She had no idea that, in that simple act of kindness, she had just changed Ben's life forever. As Sarah made her way back to her vegetables, she felt a deep sense of peace wash over her. It wasn't the relief of knowing she had done something heroic, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had done what was right. Little did she know that, many years later, Ben would remember her kindness and the promise he made to repay it, and in the process, he would change both of their lives forever. Ben Anderson sat in the exam hall, gripping his pencil tightly as his mind drifted back to the events that had led him here. The paper in front of him blurred into a haze, his thoughts lost in a sea of memories. He could still see Sarah's face as she had handed the principal the last of her money. Her unwavering kindness shining through her tired eyes. If not for her, he thought, he wouldn't be sitting there at that moment. He would have been wandering the streets, ashamed, hopeless, without a future. When the exam finally ended, Ben slowly packed his books, his mind heavy with gratitude. As he walked home, his steps felt strangely lighter. Despite all the struggles his family faced, despite the hardships that had become a part of his everyday life, today he felt a sense of hope that had been missing for as long as he could remember. Sarah's kindness had given him something far more precious than money. It had given him a chance. That evening, when Ben entered his small home, his parents were sitting in the living room, weary from their own struggles. His mother, Linda, was sewing a torn piece of clothing, while his father, Michael, leaned against a chair, exhausted from a long day at the construction site. They didn't see the joy in Ben's eyes at first. Ben, why do you look so tired? His mother asked. Looking up from her work, Ben dropped his school bag by the door and ran to her, his emotions overwhelming him. Without saying a word, he wrapped his arms around her, his body shaking. Mom, Dad, something happened today, he whispered, his voice breaking. Michael sat up, concern clouding his features. What is it, son? Did something happen at school? Ben pulled back from his mother and wiped his eyes. I was sent out of the exam hall today, because my school fees weren't paid, he explained, the words barely escaping his throat. Linda gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Oh my God, Ben, why didn't you tell us? Michael's face darkened, a deep pain settling in his chest. You know things have been hard, son. I was hoping to get paid this week so we could settle it. I never wanted you to suffer because of our struggles. Ben shook his head, his voice steady now. It's okay, Dad. Someone helped me. The room fell silent as both his parents looked at him, confused. Who helped you? His father asked. A woman at the market, Ben said, his voice trembling with admiration. Her name is Sarah Adams. She saw me crying in the street, and when I told her what had happened, she took me to school and paid my fees. She didn't know me, but she helped me anyway. She used her last bit of money to save me. Linda and Michael exchanged a look of disbelief. A stranger had done this for their son? Where can we find her? Michael asked, his voice thick with emotion. Ben's eyes sparkled. She sells vegetables at the market. I saw her sitting under a small umbrella when I first met her. Without wasting a moment, Michael and Linda stood, determination on their faces. We have to find her, Michael said, his voice filled with gratitude. The journey to the market wasn't long, but it felt like an eternity. As they approached, the sun had begun to set, casting a golden glow over the busy stalls. The air was thick with the smell of fresh vegetables and the remnants of the day's hard work. Ben led his parents down the narrow path between the vendors, searching for Sarah's stall. Then, he spotted her. Sarah sat on a small stool, her hands resting on her lap as she watched the last of the market crowd disperse. Her eyes were tired, but there was a sense of peace in the way she held herself. "That's her," Ben whispered. His parents walked toward Sarah, their hearts heavy with gratitude. Sarah looked up and recognized Ben immediately. She smiled warmly, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Ah, my son," she said. "How did your exam go?" Ben's voice trembled. "I did well, ma'am," he said. Before Sarah could reply, Linda knelt before her, holding her hands tightly. "Madam Sarah," she sobbed, her voice full of emotion. Thank you for what you did for my son." Sarah's eyes widened, and she tried to lift Linda up. "Oh, no, dear, please, stand up." But Linda refused, her tears falling freely. "You don't understand. We've been struggling for so long. And now, because of you, our son has a future." Michael's voice cracked. "I lost my job last year, and we haven't been able to pay for his school fees. We feared he might have to drop out. But you," his voice broke, and he could hardly finish his sentence. Sarah shook her head gently. "I only did what I would want someone to do for my own children." Linda, finally standing, wiped her tears away. "But you gave your last money. What about your children?" she asked softly. Sarah smiled a small, weary smile. "God provides, dear." Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out the little money he had. "Please take this," he said. "It's not much, but..." Sarah raised her hand, stopping him. "No, my son, I cannot take it. That boy," she gestured toward Ben, "is enough of a reward for me. One day, he will be great, and that will be my blessing." Ben looked at Sarah, his admiration for her deepening. "I will never forget you, ma'am," he said firmly. Sarah smiled, patting his head. "Go and make me proud, my son." As they left, Ben's heart swelled with gratitude. Sarah's simple act of kindness had changed the course of his life. And he promised himself he would never forget what she had done for him. Little did Sarah know, she had not only changed Ben's life but had set him on a path to greatness. The years that followed were not easy for Ben and his family. But they were years of transformation. His life, once defined by struggle and uncertainty, began to take a new shape. The promise he had made to Sarah, the promise to repay her kindness, burned brightly in his heart. Every day, as he sat in school or studied late into the night, he was reminded of the woman who had changed everything for him. His determination to succeed was fueled not just by a desire for a better life, but by a deep sense of gratitude. Ben poured himself into his studies. Where once he had been distracted and lost, he now found purpose. His grades soared as he focused, day after day, on mastering the subjects that had once seemed insurmountable. He spent hours reading, solving math problems, and preparing for exams. Even when the lights at home went out, he would sit by the window, using the faint glow of the streetlights to continue his studies. Ben knew that this was his chance to prove that Sarah's sacrifice was not in vain. His teachers quickly noticed the change in him. He was no longer just another student, he was the student who worked harder than anyone else. They saw his potential and encouraged him, pushing him to go further. His math teacher, in particular, took a special interest in Ben, often telling him that if he kept working this hard, he would go on to do great things. And Ben believed him. He believed that he could be someone important, someone who could make a difference. His efforts didn't go unnoticed. In his final year of high school, he ranked among the top students in his class. He won academic prizes, earned scholarships, and impressed everyone with his dedication and intellect. But even as he excelled, life remained difficult for his family. His father, Michael, struggled with finding stable work, and his mother, Linda, took on multiple jobs to help make ends meet. Yet, despite these hardships, Ben never wavered. When the time came for university admissions, Ben was accepted into one of the best institutions in the country to study petroleum engineering. It was a moment of joy and pride. But it was also a moment of fear. His parents simply did not have the money to pay for his tuition. For a brief moment, Ben wondered if his dream would be crushed before it even began. But Ben was not the type to give up. He applied for every scholarship he could find, wrote countless essays, attended interviews, and pleaded with sponsors. He didn't know if it would work, but he knew he had to try. And then, one day, the letter came. He had received a full scholarship. Tears of relief and joy filled his eyes as he read the letter over and over again. This was it, the opportunity he had been waiting for. Ben's parents were overwhelmed with emotion, and his mother cried as she hugged him tightly. For the first time in years, Ben saw the weight of their struggles lift, even if just a little. As Ben packed his bags and prepared to leave for university, he couldn't help but think of Sarah. He had promised her that one day, when he was successful, he would give back to her. He would make her proud. But he also knew that this success was not just for him. It was for his family. And it was for Sarah. University life was a challenge. But Ben was tougher. He excelled in his studies, becoming a leader among his peers. He made valuable connections in the engineering world, securing an internship at one of the biggest oil companies in the country. It was there that Ben truly began to shine. His intelligence, hard work, and dedication impressed the executives at the company. And by the time he graduated, they offered him a permanent job. At just 24 years old, Ben Anderson became an engineer at one of the world's leading oil firms. His rise was swift, and within a few years, he had been promoted to senior project manager, leading multi-million-dollar projects. His success was a testament to his hard work. But it was also a reminder of the woman who had given him a chance when he had nothing. Yet, despite all his achievements, Ben remained humble. He never forgot where he came from or the sacrifices his parents had made for him. And most importantly, he never forgot Sarah. Years passed, and Ben Anderson's success continued to soar. He had become a name known throughout the industry, an accomplished engineer, a senior project manager, and eventually one of the youngest executives at one of the world's leading oil firms. His achievements were vast, but amidst all his accomplishments, there was one thing that never left him: the memory of Sarah Adams. The woman who had changed his life with a simple act of kindness. Ben often spoke about Sarah, sharing her story with anyone who would listen. He told them how a poor widow, who had nothing left to give, had used her last bit of money to pay for his school fees. He spoke of the profound impact that act of generosity had on his life. How it shaped the man he had become. One evening, Ben found himself on stage at a business summit, surrounded by executives and leaders from across the nation. The audience waited expectantly for him to share his secrets to success. But instead of business strategies, he shared Sarah's story, telling them about the woman who had saved him. He ended his speech with a powerful message: one act of kindness can change a life forever. The applause was thunderous. But for Ben, the most important part of his journey was yet to come. He had promised Sarah that he would find her and repay her kindness. And now, with all his wealth and influence, he was ready to fulfill that promise. After months of searching, Ben finally found Sarah. She was living a simple life in a small village, far from the busy streets where they had met. He brought her into his world, ensuring that she would never know hardship again. And as he looked at her, sitting in the comfort of her new home, he knew that his success had never been about the money, the fame, or the career. It had always been about giving back to the person who had changed everything for him. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel to follow more life-changing stories. Thank you for watching.